All right, let's dive into the Black Death. You know, that topic that just, like, never gets old. Like, can you imagine you're in Europe in the 1300s, right? No antibiotics, just rumors flying around, and then boom, this plague is everywhere.
It really is like one of those huge turning points, right? In world history, I mean.
Yeah,
And it's not nearly as simple as people think it is.
yeah. No, I mean, for the longest time, everybody always said, oh, it came from China, but there's been some new research on that, hasn't there?
Yeah, that's right. Like, all this recent genetic stuff is pointing to Central Asia, actually. Think of it like those trade routes, like the Silk Road. They were connecting the East and the West, you know?
So basically, the world was already globalized, in a way, even back then.
Exactly. It's pretty incredible,
Yeah,
right?
right.
But that also meant that diseases could, like, spread really fast.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it
Yeah.
was like a superhighway for a pandemic.
Yeah, unfortunately, yeah. That's exactly what happened. So it went from Central Asia and traveled along the trade routes. It eventually got to Europe in 1347. And one of the first big outbreaks was in Sicily because of ships from the Black Sea.
And then from there, it just blew up all over Europe, right?
It was really, really bad. It only took a few years for the plague to get to Italy, France, Spain, England, basically everywhere. And the impact was, well, imagine. Whole towns wiped out, the economy destroyed, everyone living in fear. It was probably just chaos. We're talking like maybe 60% of the entire population of Europe gone, just from the initial outbreak.
60%. That's just, I mean, I knew it was bad, but that is just crazy.
It's hard to even imagine, right? Like the sheer scale of it all.
Mm.
And this is the really scary part. The Black Death didn't just happen once.
Wait, what? So it came back more than once?
Yeah, it came back in waves
Yeah.
for centuries. For example, there was the Great Plague of London in 1665. So that was more than 300 years after the first time around.
Wow. So it's like that saying, history repeats itself, but like a million times worse. But why, though? Why did it keep coming back?
Well, a few things were going on. So the bacteria that actually caused the plague, it's called Yersinia pestis, and it stayed alive in these rodent populations. So rodents were the real carriers of the plague.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense.
Right. And then you've got fleas, tiny, but so terrifying. They would bite the infected rodents and then spread the bacteria to humans. And medieval hygiene, well, let's just say it wasn't exactly a priority back then.
Yeah, and I think it was also that whole miasma theory going around, where people thought bad air made you sick.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That idea, it affected, well, everything. How they designed cities, how they treated illnesses. People honestly believed that bad smells and stale air was what caused diseases. So they'd walk around with like herbs or burn incense or even avoid taking baths because they thought water would open up your pores and that would let the bad air in.
So they were actually making things worse by trying to stop it.
Sometimes, yeah. The sanitation or lack of it, it really made the disease spread faster. And then some of the treatments they used, bloodletting, purging, all these weird mixtures, they didn't really work. And sometimes they even made things worse.
It's kind of a miracle anyone lived through all of that.
Right.
Yeah.
It shows just how resilient people are. But, you know, it also makes you appreciate how far we've come with, like, medicine and public health.
Mm.
And of course, we have to acknowledge that luck probably played a role too, and natural immunity.
I guess even in pandemics, there's a ton of different things happening all at once. But speaking of people trying to fight the plague, we have to talk about the plague doctors. You know, the costumes, the mystery, it's all so fascinating.
Oh, yeah. People are obsessed with them, both back then and now. And it's true that their medical knowledge wasn't that great, but they played a really complicated role in fighting the plague, one that most people don't really get.
All right, well, let's break it all down. Everyone knows the masks, the ones that look like beaks, but why were they dressed like that? What was the point?
Okay, remember the miasma theory, that bad air stuff. So they designed their outfits to protect themselves from that bad air.
So they were kind of like wearing, I don't know, like a hazmat suit.
Yeah, exactly. The long coats, they were waxed, so liquids would slide right off. And the masks, they were stuffed with things that smelled strong, like dried flowers, herbs, spices. It was supposed to purify the air. And they would even use a cane to examine patients so they wouldn't have to actually touch them.
It's so interesting that they were already trying to like make a barrier to protect themselves from the disease, even though they didn't even know how it spread.
It really shows you how clever people can be, even in a crisis. They were going up against something they didn't understand and just trying anything they could think of to protect themselves.
Yeah.
And everyone else.
And so beyond the costumes, what was their job? I mean, were they just doctors or was it something else?
It was more than just being a doctor. It was almost like being a public health official. Towns and cities would hire them to treat the sick, especially the poor. They had to keep track of who was dying, figure out how the disease was moving, and even do autopsies.
So they were like the first epidemiologists in a way.
Yeah, exactly. And their records give us so much information about how the plague impacted people. And it was incredibly dangerous work.
Oh, yeah. I can only imagine how hard it must have been to see that much death and sickness all the time.
They were literally on the front lines of this terrifying pandemic. And their stories, I think, really give us a glimpse into a world that was dealing with something that was truly unimaginable, and just how much they did to survive.
Okay, so we've talked about, their outfits and how they were like public health officials, but what was it like to actually be a plague doctor?
Imagine like living in constant fear, right? And not just for yourself, you'd be worried about your family too. Every time you go to see a patient, you could be bringing the plague back home.
It's like those healthcare workers today, during a pandemic, but at least they have a better idea how to protect themselves now.
Exactly. Back then, it was all about the costumes and that miasma theory. But we know that it was really fleas that were spreading it. So even with their masks and those waxed coats, they were in a lot of danger.
And they were going into these homes, and the sanitation was probably, it would be awful by our standards, right? It must have been just overwhelming in every way.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And besides the physical risk, there was the mental toll, just seeing death everywhere. Every family was grieving, afraid. You're supposed to be there to give them hope, but you're also a reminder that they could die.
It's like you're needed, but also feared, right?
Yeah, it's this weird contradiction. And the treatments they use, like bloodletting, that was really common. They thought it would balance out the humors in the body, but it just made people weaker.
Bloodletting. It's crazy, right? They would use leeches for that, I think. Didn't they ever think, hey, maybe this isn't working?
Well, some people did disagree. But that humor theory, it was like the standard medical thinking for centuries. It must have been so frustrating, for those plague doctors who knew it wasn't helping or even hurting.
Yeah, and they couldn't just, look it up on the internet or call another doctor for advice.
Right, they were completely isolated. But they kept going. They took notes on every case, all the symptoms, what happened, and those records, even though they were written so long ago, are super valuable to us today.
So they were really trying to solve this mystery, even though they couldn't even see what they were fighting.
The Black Death, it really pushed people to start thinking about medicine differently.